The Russian words tumbled from Eleanor's lips like water from a broken dam, soft and melodic, despite the terror in her voice. Marcus knelt in the snow beside her, his arms still burning from carrying her 120-pound frame nearly half a mile through knee-deep drifts. She gripped his jacket with surprising strength, her pale blue eyes wide with confusion. "Yeah? Što slučilo?" she whispered, then switched to accented English. "Where am I?" "The snow. It wasn't snowing when I left Moscow." Moscow. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Eleanor Blackwood had never been further east than Denver, as far as he knew. She'd lived in Pine Ridge her entire life, married to Henry Blackwood, the local mine foreman who died of a heart attack 3 years ago. Everyone knew Eleanor, the woman who baked extra pies for the church social and left wildflower bouquets on the Veterans Memorial every Memorial Day. "Mrs. Blackwood, you're in Colorado," Marcus said gently, helping her sit up against a pine tree. The blizzard still raged around them, but they'd found shelter in a grove about 50 yards from the trail. "You're safe. I'm Marcus Holloway, Ruth's grandson." Eleanor's, or Katarina's, face scrunched in concentration. "Blackwood? No, my name is Katarina Volkov. I am 22. She touched her face with trembling fingers, feeling the deep lines around her eyes, the loose skin of her neck. Her breathing quickened. This cannot be my face." Marcus pulled off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Through the storm, he could barely make out the warm glow of his grandmother's cabin windows in the distance. They needed to get inside before hypothermia set in, but something told him not to rush this moment. Something was happening here that defied explanation. "What's the last thing you remember?" he asked. Katarina closed her eyes, snow collecting in her silver hair. "I was walking to meet Dmitri at the university. We had plans to—" She paused, pressing her palms against her temples. The date was February 15th, 1962. It was snowing, but not like this. Light flurries. Her eyes snapped open. "What year is it now?" 2024. The word hung between them like a blade. Katarina stared at him for a long moment, then began to laugh, a broken, desperate sound that made Marcus's chest tighten. He'd heard that kind of laugh before, in the days after the accident, when he'd catch glimpses of his own reflection and wonder how he was still breathing when his parents weren't. 62 years, she whispered. Gone. Marcus helped her to her feet, his mind racing. Head injuries could cause confusion, memory loss, even personality changes, but not like this, not this complete. And the Russian, where had that come from? The Eleanor he'd known spoke only English, had lived her entire life in this isolated mountain community. They made their way slowly through the storm toward his grandmother's cabin. Katarina leaned heavily on his arm, stopping every few steps to stare at her wrinkled hands, as if they belonged to someone else. When they reached the porch, she paused at the sight of a wind chime made from old mining tools. "Henry made that," she said suddenly, her voice different now, warmer, more familiar. He was always making things with his hands. Then she blinked, confusion returning. "Who is Henry?" Marcus knocked snow from his boots before opening the door. The cabin's warmth hit them like a wall, scented with his grandmother's ever-present coffee and the cedar logs crackling in the fireplace. Ruth Holloway looked up from her knitting, her weathered face creasing with concern. "Marcus, thank God you're back. I was worried sick when the storm—" She stopped mid-sentence as she took in their unexpected guest. "Eleanor, what on earth are you doing out in this weather?" "Ya ne ponimayu," Katarina responded, then caught herself. "I don't understand. You know me?" Ruth's knitting needles clattered to the floor. In the 47 years Marcus had known his grandmother, he'd never seen her look genuinely shocked. Worried, yes. Sad, certainly, especially in the months after his parents died. But never this wide-eyed, almost frightened expression. "Ruth," Marcus said carefully. "She says her name is Katarina. She doesn't remember being Eleanor." His grandmother stood slowly, her arthritis forgotten. She approached Katarina with the cautious steps of someone approaching a wild animal. "Eleanor, honey, you've had some kind of episode. Let's get you warm and—" "Stop calling me that name." Katarina's voice cracked. "I am not this Eleanor. I am Katarina Volkov, and I need to find Dmitri. He'll be worried." Ruth and Marcus exchanged glances. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and hungry, rattling the windows. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this storm had brought more than snow to their mountain. It had brought secrets that someone, somewhere, had worked very hard to keep buried. Ruth moved to the kitchen with practiced efficiency, filling the kettle and setting out her good china cups, the ones with tiny blue roses that she reserved for emergencies and holidays. Marcus recognized the ritual. His grandmother always made tea when the world tilted sideways. She'd done the same thing the night the state trooper came to their door 18 months ago, his hat in his hands and terrible news on his lips. "Sit her by the fire," Ruth called over her shoulder, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she measured tea leaves. "Get those wet clothes off her before she catches pneumonia." Marcus guided Katarina to the overstuffed armchair, where he'd spent countless evenings reading, her fingers trailing along the worn fabric as if trying to place a memory just out of reach. She seemed smaller now in the lamplight, more fragile than the sturdy widow who'd brought them casseroles after the funeral and helped Ruth tend her vegetable garden last summer. "This place," Katarina murmured, studying the cabin's familiar details, the collection of antique mining lanterns on the mantel, the faded photographs of Pine Ridge's founding families, Ruth's impressive library squeezed onto handmade shelves. "I know this place, but not like this." Marcus knelt to build up the fire, stealing glances at her profile. In the flickering light, he could almost see the young woman she claimed to be, the way she held her chin and the elegant line of her neck despite the deep creases time had carved there. It should have been impossible, but then again, impossible had become relative in his world since the accident. When you've already lived through your worst nightmare, reality felt negotiable. "Marcus!" Ruth's voice drew him back to the kitchen, where she stood gripping the counter, her knuckles white. Did she say anything else? About what she remembers? She thinks it's 1962. Keeps asking about someone named Dmitri. He lowered his voice. "Grandma, she was speaking perfect Russian." "Since when does Eleanor speak Russian?" Ruth's mouth pressed into a thin line, the same expression she wore whenever Marcus asked too many questions about his parents' work, their frequent trips, the locked filing cabinet in their bedroom that she'd refused to let him touch. "People learn languages, Marcus. Maybe she studied it in school." But her tone carried the careful neutrality of someone hiding something, and Marcus had learned to recognize that particular shade of deception. Living with Ruth meant navigating an intricate map of subjects she'd rather not discuss. His parents, mysterious consulting work, the reason they'd moved to Pine Ridge when he was 10, why his father had changed their last name from Holloway to Holloway, and especially why his parents had been driving that remote mountain road at midnight on a Tuesday with no explanation for where they'd been. The kettle's whistle cut through his thoughts. Ruth poured hot water over the tea leaves, the aromatic steam fogging her glasses. This was their world now. Careful routines in a cabin that felt too empty, conversations that danced around grief like water flowing around stones. Marcus had his schoolwork to finish online, his part-time job at Morrison's Hardware in town, his carefully structured days that kept him from thinking too hard about the future stretching ahead without his parents' voices filling the silence. "The tea's ready," Ruth announced, carrying the service on a wooden tray his grandfather had carved decades ago. But when they returned to the living room, Katarina was gone. The front door stood slightly ajar, cold wind stirring the curtains. Marcus rushed outside, his socks soaking through immediately in the snow. "Katarina!" He found her standing in the middle of the yard, her face turned up to the falling snow, arms outstretched like she was trying to embrace the storm. She'd left Ruth's spare slippers by the door, and her bare feet were already turning blue against the white ground. "The snow tastes different," she said when Marcus reached her. "In Moscow, it tasted like coal smoke and car exhaust. Here, it tastes like—" She paused, catching flakes on her tongue. "Like secrets. You'll freeze to death." Marcus took her elbow gently. "Come inside." She let him guide her back toward the cabin, but stopped at the mailbox. In the dim glow of the porch light, her fingers traced the name Holloway painted in Ruth's careful script. "Your grandmother," she said slowly. "She has kind eyes, but she's afraid of me." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "Why would she be afraid of you?" Katarina looked at him with an expression far too knowing for someone who claimed to remember nothing past 1962. "Because, Marcus Holloway, some secrets are buried so deep that when they surface, they bring everything else up with them." Inside the cabin, Ruth waited by the fire, her tea growing cold as she stared at a photograph on the mantel, one Marcus had never paid much attention to before. It showed a group of young people standing in front of a university building, their faces bright with possibility. But now, in the lamplight, one face seemed to shimmer with familiar features, and Marcus wondered how many other things he'd failed to truly see. Marcus guided Katarina back inside, her bare feet leaving damp prints on Ruth's braided rug. His grandmother hadn't moved from her position by the mantel, still clutching that photograph like a lifeline. In the sudden quiet after the storm's howling, the cabin felt charged with unspoken tension. "Ruth?" Marcus closed the door behind them, noting how his grandmother's shoulders stiffened at the sound of her name. "Everything okay?" She turned slowly, sliding the photograph behind a collection of mining memorabilia with practiced casualness. But not before Marcus caught another glimpse of those young faces and the unsettling certainty that he'd seen that particular smile before, not in old photographs, but sitting across from him at Sunday dinners. "Of course, dear." Ruth's voice carried forced brightness as she bustled toward Katarina with a thick quilt. "Let's get you properly warmed up, Eleanor. You gave us quite a scare." "I told you," Katarina said wearily, accepting the quilt but fixing Ruth with a steady gaze. "I am not Eleanor. Though you already know that, don't you, Ruth Holloway?" The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples Marcus couldn't quite follow. His grandmother's face went carefully blank, the same expression she'd worn whenever his parents received those midnight phone calls, the ones that sent them rushing out into the night with hushed explanations about work emergencies. "I don't know what you mean," Ruth said, but her hands trembled as she poured fresh tea. Katarina settled into the armchair, studying Ruth with uncomfortable intensity. "You have the same tells as your son did. The way your left eye twitches when you lie. David always did that, even as a boy." The teacup slipped from Ruth's fingers, shattering against the hearthstones. Marcus jerked backward, his mind reeling. Katarina had just mentioned his father by name. His father, who'd died 18 months ago, whom Eleanor Blackwood had met perhaps a dozen times at town functions. "How do you know my father's name?" Marcus's voice came out strangled. Katarina pressed her fingertips to her temples, confusion flickering across her features. "I don't know, it just came to me, like remembering a dream." Ruth knelt slowly to collect the broken china, her movements mechanical. "People talk in small towns, Marcus. Eleanor knew your parents." But even as she spoke, Marcus caught the way Ruth's gaze darted toward the locked drawer in the secretary desk. The one she'd always claimed contained just old bills and tax records whenever he'd asked about it. The same drawer his parents used to access with a small brass key that had disappeared after their funeral. "The storm's getting worse," Ruth announced suddenly, abandoning the broken cup pieces. "Marcus, help me check the shutters, make sure they're secure." It was busy work, and they all knew it. But Marcus followed her to the kitchen window anyway, watching Ruth's reflection in the dark glass as she fumbled with the already secure latch. "Grandma," he said quietly, "what aren't you telling me?" Ruth's hands stilled on the window frame. Outside, snow swirled in hypnotic patterns, and for a moment Marcus thought she might finally answer one of his questions honestly. Instead, she turned toward the living room where Katarina sat staring into the fire. "Some things are better left buried, Marcus. Your parents understood that." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before Ruth could respond, Katarina's voice drifted from the living room, soft and melodic. She was singing something in Russian, a lullaby that seemed to pull at memories Marcus didn't even know he had. The melody felt familiar, like something that had drifted through his childhood dreams. They returned to find Katarina holding the poker, examining the brass handle with forensic attention. "This is new," she murmured. "The old one had an inscription, something about eternal winter." Ruth went rigid. "Echnaya zima," she whispered, then caught herself. "I mean, you speak Russian too," Katarina observed with satisfaction. "Interesting." The room fell silent except for the fire's crackling and the storm's relentless assault on the windows. Marcus felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, sensing vast depths beneath him that he'd never known existed. His entire life suddenly felt like a carefully constructed stage set, and someone had just pulled back the curtain. "I think," he said slowly, "it's time someone told me the truth." Ruth and Katarina exchanged a look that lasted far too long, filled with communication Marcus couldn't decipher. In that moment, he realized his choice was simple. He could retreat to the safety of ignorance, accept the comfortable lies that had shaped his world, or step forward into whatever dangerous truth these women shared. Outside, something metallic clanged against the house, probably a loose piece of siding torn free by the wind, but in the charged atmosphere of the cabin, it sounded like a warning bell, marking the moment when Marcus Holloway's ordinary world cracked completely open. But as soon as the words left his mouth, Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. The truth, what if he didn't want it? What if the comfortable lies Ruth had constructed were all that stood between him and something that would destroy what little stability he'd managed to build after losing his parents? He took a step backward, his shoulder bumping against the kitchen door frame. "Actually, maybe we should focus on getting through the storm first. Mrs. Blackwood probably just needs rest, medical attention." "Coward," Katarina said softly, but not unkindly. Her eyes held a strange sympathy. "You're afraid of what we might tell you." "I'm not afraid." The lie tasted bitter. Of course he was afraid. Fear had been his constant companion since the accident, fear of being alone, fear of the future, fear that the careful routine he'd built with Ruth would collapse and leave him with nothing. "I just think there's probably a logical explanation for all this." Ruth seized on his hesitation like a lifeline. "Exactly. Eleanor's had some kind of episode. Head trauma, maybe, or a reaction to medication. We should call Dr. Peterson in the morning." But even as his grandmother spoke, Marcus could see the relief flooding her features. She wanted him to back down, to return to their safe world of unasked questions and careful silences. The realization hit him like cold water. Ruth was just as terrified as he was. What kind of truth scared a woman who'd survived the death of her husband, raised her son alone, and held Marcus together through the worst grief of his life? "The phone lines are down," Marcus said automatically, though he hadn't checked. It was easier to focus on logistics than face the growing certainty that his entire life had been built on foundations of sand. Katarina stood slowly, moving to the bookshelf where Ruth kept her collection of local history volumes. Her fingers traced the spines with surprising familiarity. "You have David's copy of Mountain Mining Communities," she observed. "He used to read passages aloud when he was nervous." Marcus's breath caught. His father had done exactly that, recited dry historical facts whenever he was agitated, a habit that had driven Marcus crazy during his teenage years. How could Eleanor Blackwood, who'd lived in Pine Ridge her entire life, know such an intimate detail about a man who'd only moved to town 7 years ago? "Stop," Ruth said sharply. "Just stop this." "Stop what?" Katarina turned, and in the firelight, her aged features seemed to shift and blur. For just a moment, Marcus could swear he saw the face of a young woman superimposed over Eleanor's familiar wrinkles. "Stop remembering. Stop being inconvenient." The word remembering sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the storm. Because if Katarina was remembering things about his father, things no stranger should know, then what else might she remember? And what might those memories reveal about David Holloway's past? The past he'd never discussed, the work he'd never explained, the reasons he'd sometimes disappeared for days at a time with nothing but vague mentions of consulting. "I need air," Marcus announced suddenly, moving toward the door. "You can't go out in this storm," Ruth protested. But Marcus was already pulling on his coat, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of questions he wasn't ready to face. Outside, the blizzard hit him like a physical wall, snow stinging his face and wind threatening to knock him off his feet. He stumbled toward the old equipment shed where his father used to disappear for hours, claiming he was organizing tools. The shed door fought him, warped from years of mountain weather, but finally gave way with a groan. Inside, Marcus fumbled for the battery-powered lantern his father had kept on a shelf beside rusted mining equipment left by previous tenants. The weak light revealed what it always had: garden tools, fishing gear, stacks of old National Geographic magazines. Nothing suspicious, nothing mysterious, just the accumulated debris of ordinary life. So why was his heart racing? Marcus sank onto an overturned crate, pressing his palms against his eyes. Through the thin walls he could hear the storm's fury, but underneath that was something else. The distant sound of voices from the cabin, Ruth and Katarina, talking in urgent whispers he couldn't quite make out. He should go back inside. He should demand answers, force them to explain how Eleanor Blackwood had transformed into someone who knew his father's nervous habits and his grandmother's tells. He should be brave enough to face whatever truth they were hiding. But bravery had never been his strong suit. It had taken him months to work up the courage to ask Ruth about his parents' work, and when he finally had, her stricken expression had made him immediately back down. It was easier to live with questions than risk losing the only family he had left. The shed door creaked in the wind, a lonely sound that matched the hollow feeling in his chest. Outside, the storm raged on, and Marcus Holloway sat in the darkness, choosing safety over truth and hating himself for it. But then Marcus heard it, laughter. Not the harsh cackle of madness, but genuine amusement drifting from the cabin through the storm. Katarina's laugh, rich and warm, followed immediately by Ruth's softer chuckle. The sound was so unexpected, so completely at odds with the tension he'd fled, that it cut through his paralysis like a blade. When had he last heard his grandmother laugh like that? Not since before the funeral, certainly. Maybe not since before his parents had started taking those mysterious trips, coming home with worry lines etched deeper around their eyes, and conversations that died the moment Marcus entered a room. The voices grew clearer as the wind shifted, and Marcus found himself leaning toward the door, straining to hear. Ruth was speaking in what sounded like Russian, a pronunciation careful but confident. His grandmother, who claimed to know only enough Spanish to order dinner on their rare trips to Denver, was holding a conversation in a language she'd never admitted knowing. Marcus pressed his ear to the cold wood of the door. The phrases were indistinct, but the cadence was unmistakable. Ruth wasn't struggling with unfamiliar words. She was fluent. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. His grandmother had lied to him. Not a small, protective lie about whether his parents had suffered in the crash, but a fundamental deception about who she was. And if Ruth had been hiding her knowledge of Russian, what else had she concealed? He thought about the locked drawer, the brass key that had vanished, the way his parents would sometimes whisper together in what he'd assumed was some kind of code, but might have been another language entirely. He remembered his father's midnight phone calls, always answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting for them. The way both his parents would go rigid whenever news reports mentioned Russia or Eastern Europe. The wind howled through a gap in the shed wall, carrying voices from the cabin that rose and fell like music. Whatever Ruth and Katarina were discussing, it wasn't the confused ramblings of a head trauma patient. It was the reunion of two people who shared a history Marcus had never suspected. His hands were shaking as he reached for the lantern again, sweeping its beam across the familiar contents of the shed. But this time, he looked with different eyes. The fishing gear his father had used maybe 3 times. The garden tools that were too pristine for someone who supposedly grew up on a farm. The stack of National Geographic magazines that all focused on the same regions, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Soviet Union. Marcus pulled one from the middle of the pile. November 1962, the cover story, Behind the Iron Curtain, Life in Moscow. He flipped it open and immediately saw his father's handwriting in the margins, notes in English, but also symbols Marcus didn't recognize. Not Cyrillic, but definitely not any alphabet he'd learned in school. His breath came faster as he grabbed another magazine. December 1961. An article about the Berlin Wall was marked with the same strange notations. In the back pages, someone had circled classified ads for rental properties, all in remote mountain towns across Colorado. The pieces clicked together with terrible clarity. His parents hadn't been consultants. The term was too vague, too carefully neutral. They'd been something else entirely, something that required fluency in Russian and knowledge of Soviet affairs and the ability to disappear for days without explanation. Marcus set the magazine down with trembling hands. He could walk away now, return to the cabin, pretend he'd seen nothing, continue living in Ruth's carefully constructed world where his parents had been ordinary people who died in an ordinary accident on an ordinary Tuesday night. Or he could keep looking, dig deeper, follow the thread until it led him to whatever truth had been powerful enough to transform Eleanor Blackwood into someone who spoke Russian and remembered his father's nervous habits from 60 years ago. The storm seemed to pause, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Through the sudden quiet, Marcus heard Katarina call his name, not shouting, not urgent, just a gentle summons that somehow carried clearly through the wind and snow. He stood slowly, his joints stiff from cold and tension. The shed suddenly felt like a tomb, filled with the carefully preserved artifacts of lives he'd never truly known. Every object was a lie, every memory tainted by the growing certainty that nothing about his family had been what it seemed. But Katarina was calling him, and Ruth was laughing in a language she'd never admitted speaking, and somewhere in that warm cabin were answers he'd been seeking, without even knowing the questions. Marcus clicked off the lantern, plunging the shed back into darkness. When he stepped outside, the storm hit him with fresh fury, but this time he didn't fight it. He let it push him forward, toward the cabin's glowing windows, toward whatever truth waited inside. There was no going back now. The safe world of ignorance and careful lies was crumbling behind him, and Marcus Holloway was finally ready to see what lay beneath. The warmth of the cabin hit Marcus like a physical force after the brutal cold, but the scene that greeted him stopped him dead in his tracks. Ruth and Katarina sat at the kitchen table, a chess set between them, speaking in low, fluid Russian. Not the halting conversation of someone dusting off half-remembered phrases, but the easy exchange of native speakers. They looked up as he entered, and the guilt that flashed across Ruth's face confirmed everything he'd discovered in the shed. His grandmother, the woman who'd raised him, who'd held him through nightmares, who'd made him believe they had no secrets from each other, had been lying to him his entire life. "Marcus," Ruth began, switching to English, "you look frozen. Come sit by the fire." "Don't." His voice came out sharper than he'd intended. "Just don't pretend anymore. I heard you. I saw Dad's magazines in the shed, his notes. I know you've been lying to me." The chess pieces seemed to blur in his vision as anger and hurt warred in his chest. Katarina moved her bishop with steady fingers, never breaking eye contact with him. "What would you like to know?" she asked simply. Ruth shot her a warning look. "Katya, we agreed." "Katya?" Marcus's voice cracked. "You know her real name. You know who she really is." He slumped against the doorframe, suddenly exhausted. "God, does anyone in this town tell the truth about anything?" "Truth is a luxury," Katarina said, capturing one of Ruth's pawns. "In our world it was often deadly." "Our world?" Marcus pushed off from the wall. "What world? What are you talking about?" The two women exchanged another of those loaded glances, conducting an entire conversation in the space of heartbeats. Ruth's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Your grandmother and I worked together many years ago," Katarina said carefully, "as did your parents, though that came later. Work together how? Doing what? Intelligence, Ruth said quietly. During the Cold War, I was stationed in Vienna from 1959 to 1967. Katya, Eleanor, was one of our assets. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Intelligence, assets, the clinical language of spies and secrets applied to his family like labels on museum exhibits. He groped for the back of a chair, needing something solid to anchor him. "You're telling me you were spies?" "We prefer the term intelligence officers," Katarina said with grim humor, "though I suppose the distinction matters little now." Marcus's mind raced, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew. "But you're Eleanor Blackwood. You've lived in Pine Ridge for 40 years. You have a garden club membership and you bake cookies for the church fundraiser." "The best covers are the ones you can live authentically," Ruth said. "Eleanor needed to disappear after Vienna went bad in '67. We gave her a new identity, a new life. She became so thoroughly Eleanor Blackwood that even she started to believe it." "Until the storm," Katarina added softly. "Something about the cold, the stress, it stripped away the barriers I'd built in my mind. Suddenly, I was Katarina Volkov again, and Eleanor felt like a character I'd been playing." The chess game continued as they talked, both women moving pieces with automatic precision. Marcus watched, transfixed by the normalcy of it, two old spies playing chess while casually destroying his understanding of reality. "What about my parents?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Ruth's hand hesitated over her queen. "David found out about my past when he was 18. I thought I could trust him with the truth. He was so angry about the lies, just like you are now. And he demanded to know everything. About the work, about why we'd left that life behind. I told him about the network, about people like Eleanor who were still out there, living under assumed identities." Ruth's voice grew thick. "I never imagined he'd try to find them." The pieces of Marcus's shattered worldview rearranged themselves into a new, more terrifying pattern. That's what he was doing, all those trips, the consulting work. He was tracking down old intelligence assets. "Helping them," Katarina corrected. "Some of us had been abandoned when operations shut down, left to survive on our own with false identities and no support. David and Sarah made it their mission to find us, make sure we were safe. Until someone decided they were asking too many questions," Ruth finished, her voice hollow. The room fell silent except for the storm's constant assault on the windows. Marcus felt like he was drowning, each new revelation pulling him deeper into waters he'd never learned to navigate. His parents hadn't died in an accident. They'd been killed for trying to help people like Katarina, and Ruth had spent 18 months lying to him about it. "Who?" he managed. "Who killed them?" But even as he asked, Marcus realized he wasn't sure he was ready for that answer. Not yet. The truth he'd demanded was proving more dangerous than any lie Ruth had ever told. Ruth's hand froze completely over the chessboard, her knuckles white against the wooden queen. The silence stretched until Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "We don't know for certain," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the storm. "The investigation was inconclusive." Bullshit. The word came out with more venom than Marcus had ever directed at his grandmother. "You know something? You both do." Katarina leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with those unsettlingly young eyes. "There were rumors, whispers in the community of former assets your parents had contacted. Someone was tracking their movements, anticipating where they'd go next. Someone from the old network," Ruth added reluctantly. "Someone who didn't want the past disturbed." Marcus felt the cabin walls closing in around him. The cozy space that had been his sanctuary now felt like a trap, filled with dangerous knowledge he'd never asked for. "So what you're telling me is that my parents died because of your work, because of secrets from before I was even born." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Ruth flinched as if he'd slapped her. "Marcus, please." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You let me blame myself. All those nights I stayed awake thinking if I'd just called them back from Denver earlier, if I'd insisted they wait until morning to drive home. You knew it had nothing to do with the weather or timing or any of the things I've been torturing myself with." "We couldn't tell you," Ruth said, rising to face him. "You were 17, grieving, barely holding yourself together. How could we burden you with the knowledge that they'd been murdered? So instead you let me carry guilt that wasn't even mine?" Marcus's voice cracked. "Do you have any idea what this past year and a half has been like, wondering if I could have saved them somehow?" The pain in Ruth's eyes was genuine, but Marcus was too raw to care about her suffering. Every memory from the past 18 months was reshaping itself in this new light. Ruth's insistence that he not dwell on the accident, her quick deflection whenever he asked too many questions about the investigation, the way she'd practically hidden the newspaper clippings about the crash. "There's something else," Katarina said quietly, and both Marcus and Ruth turned to her with expressions of dread. "The letters I've been receiving. They weren't random. Someone knows what's happening to me, knows that my memories are returning." "What letters?" Marcus demanded. Ruth closed her eyes. "Eleanor's been getting mail postmarked from 1962. Impossible mail. I found one 2 weeks ago and thought she was having some kind of psychological episode." "They're not impossible," Katarina corrected. "They're warnings. Someone wants me to remember, or someone wants me to forget permanently. I can't tell which." She reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew a cream-colored envelope, its edges yellowed with apparent age. "This arrived yesterday. I found it in my mailbox this morning before the storm hit." Marcus took the letter with shaking hands. The postmark was clear, December 15th, 1962, Vienna, Austria. The paper felt authentically old, but the impossibility of its delivery made his skin crawl. "What does it say?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "The mountain remembers what the valley forgets," Katarina recited from memory. "Some graves are too shallow to hold their secrets." The words sent ice through Marcus's veins. He looked up to find both women watching him with expressions of fear and resignation. "Someone's playing games," Ruth said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Psychological warfare, it's an old tactic." "Or," Katarina said softly, "someone's trying to tell us that your parents weren't the only casualties of the past catching up to the present." Marcus sank back into his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. Outside, the storm seemed to intensify, as if responding to the revelation of buried secrets. The comfortable life he'd built with Ruth was completely destroyed now, revealed as nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to keep him ignorant and safe. But safe from what? And if his parents had died for trying to help people like Katarina, what did that make the people who'd killed them? "I need to know everything," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "No more protection, no more lies. If there's someone out there who killed my parents and is now threatening Eleanor, Katarina, then hiding from the truth isn't keeping anyone safe." Ruth and Katarina exchanged another loaded glance, and Marcus saw the moment they made their decision. Whatever came next would change everything, would destroy any possibility of returning to the simple life he'd known. But that life had been built on graves too shallow to hold their secrets, and Marcus was finally ready to help dig them up. The decision hung in the air between them like a blade, and Marcus watched as Ruth walked to the kitchen counter with the deliberate movements of someone approaching an execution. She opened a drawer he'd seen her use 1,000 times for mundane things, bottle openers, spare batteries, takeout menus. But now she reached beneath the liner paper and withdrew something that made his blood freeze. A gun. "Ruth, what?" Marcus started, but she was already moving toward the living room, the weapon held with the casual competence of someone long familiar with its weight. "The floorboard by the fireplace," she said to Katarina, who nodded with grim understanding. "Second plank from the hearth. Help me." Marcus watched in stunned silence as his 73-year-old grandmother pried up floorboards with practiced efficiency, revealing a metal box that looked like it had been waiting decades for this moment. The lock opened to her touch, a fingerprint scanner so advanced it seemed alien in their rustic cabin. Jesus Christ, Ruth, what is that? Insurance, she said, lifting out documents, photographs, and what looked like enough cash to buy a small car. Everything we couldn't risk throwing away but couldn't afford to have found. Katarina was studying the photographs with an intensity that made Marcus's skin crawl. Her fingers traced faces he didn't recognize, except they were all young, impossibly young, with the kind of formal poses that screamed government documentation. Vienna, 1965, she murmured, holding up a picture of herself at maybe 25, standing next to a man Marcus didn't recognize. This was after the Kozlov operation, 3 months before everything went to hell. "Who's the man?" Marcus asked, though something about the stranger's posture was eerily familiar. Ruth answered without looking up from the files she was sorting. "Alexander Petrov, my handler in Vienna, and later—" She hesitated, glancing at Marcus with an expression of profound regret. "Your father's contact when he started looking for abandoned assets." The world tilted sideways. Marcus gripped the chair so hard his knuckles went white, processing the impossible implications. "My father knew this man." "Your father trusted this man," Katarina corrected, and her voice carried a weight that made Marcus's stomach drop. "Right up until Alex started asking too many questions about why David was so interested in finding me specifically." "No." Marcus stood so fast the chair toppled backward. "You're not saying what I think you're saying." But Ruth's silence was answer enough. She set down a file thick with Cyrillic text and surveillance photos, and Marcus saw his own father's face, staring back from a dozen different angles. David Holloway, age 43, photographed without his knowledge outside a motel in Grand Junction, outside a diner in Durango, outside Eleanor Blackwood's house in Pine Ridge. "Alex had been watching us for months," Ruth said quietly. "Watching your parents track down assets. At first we thought he was just being cautious, making sure they weren't compromised or working for the wrong people. But then David called me the night before they died. He said Alex had offered to arrange a meeting with a group of former assets who needed help. Said it would save them months of searching." Marcus felt like he was drowning in ice water. It was a trap. "David was smart enough to be suspicious," Katarina added, "but Sarah convinced him to go. She said they couldn't ignore the possibility of helping that many people at once." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. His parents had died because they'd been too decent to turn away from people who needed help. They'd walked into Alexander Petrov's trap because refusing meant abandoning the abandoned, and that wasn't who they were. Where is he now? Marcus's voice sounded strange, detached, like it was coming from someone else's throat. "This Alex Petrov." Ruth and Katarina exchanged another of those loaded glances, and Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that this was the moment everything truly changed. Not the revelation about the spying, or the lies, or even his parents' murder. This was the moment when he stopped being a victim of circumstances and became an active participant in whatever came next. "We think he's here," Katarina said simply. "In Pine Ridge." The storm outside seemed to pause, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Through the windows Marcus could see nothing but swirling white, but suddenly the darkness felt populated, malevolent, like eyes were watching from every shadow. "The letters," he said, understanding flooding through him like poison. "He's been sending the letters." "And watching me recover my memories," Katarina confirmed. "The question is whether he wants them back to finish what he started, or whether he's trying to trigger something else entirely." Marcus looked around the cabin, at the hidden weapons, the secret files, the two women who'd spent decades building new lives on top of buried secrets. Everything familiar had become foreign. Everything safe had become dangerous. And somewhere in the storm outside, a killer was waiting. Marcus stared at the storm-lashed windows, his mind reeling with the implications. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How long has he been here?" "We're not certain," Ruth admitted, checking the gun's clip with movements that spoke of muscle memory decades old. "But Eleanor, Katarina, started having episodes 3 weeks ago. The first letter arrived 2 days later. He's been watching me, remember, Katarina said, her accent thickening with stress, waiting to see how much comes back naturally before he decides what to do about it. Marcus felt trapped between fury and terror. So what's the plan? We just sit here and wait for a trained killer to decide our fate? Ruth was already moving, gathering files and stuffing them into a waterproof bag. We run, tonight. There's a safe house in Silverton that... The lights went out. Emergency battery fixtures kicked in a second later, casting everything in hellish red shadows. Through the howling wind, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze, the distant growl of a snowmobile engine getting closer. Ruth, Katarina's voice was deadly calm. The phone line, Ruth grabbed the landline receiver, her face going pale in the red light. Dead. Marcus's phone showed no signal. Not unusual during storms this severe, but now every normal inconvenience felt like part of a calculated assault. They were completely cut off, trapped in a cabin that suddenly felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Back door, Ruth whispered, moving with surprising speed toward the kitchen. But Katarina grabbed her arm. No, listen. They froze, straining to hear over the storm. The snowmobile engine had stopped, but Marcus caught something worse. The deliberate crunch of footsteps in snow, circling the cabin. Slow, patient, professional. He's not alone, Katarina breathed. As if summoned by her words, another set of footsteps became audible from the opposite side of the cabin. Then another. Marcus counted at least 3 distinct patterns, maybe 4, moving to surround them completely. The shed, Marcus whispered desperately. We could make it to the shed, use Dad's. The shed's been compromised for hours, a familiar voice called from outside, muffled but audible through the storm. Marcus's heart stopped. He knew that voice, friendly, concerned, helpful. Dr. Graham, their family doctor for the past 15 years, the man who'd helped Ruth through her arthritis, who'd prescribed Marcus's anxiety medication after his parents died. Hello, Ruth, Dr. Graham continued, his tone conversational despite the howling wind. I think it's time we had that conversation you've been avoiding. Ruth's face went ashen. Michael, she whispered. Michael Graham is Alexander Petrov. The betrayal hit Marcus like a physical blow. Every prescription, every checkup, every concerned question about how they were coping, all of it surveillance. Dr. Graham had been watching them, studying them, waiting for the right moment for 18 months. You killed my parents, Marcus shouted toward the door, rage overwhelming caution. Your parents killed themselves, came the calm reply. The moment they decided to play in a game they didn't understand. David thought he could be a hero, save people like our dear Katarina here. But some people don't want to be saved. They want to be left alone with their new lives. Katarina was moving through the cabin with desperate efficiency, checking windows, calculating angles. There, she pointed to the bathroom window. It's our only chance. Ruth shook her head. You'll never make it to the tree line, not in this storm. We'll die if we stay here, Marcus said. But even as the words left his mouth, he heard the distinctive click of someone checking a rifle's action. Multiple rifles. Actually, Dr. Graham called out, I'd like to propose an alternative. Ruth and Marcus can walk away from this. Clean slate, no harm done. All I need is 5 minutes alone with Katarina to help her remember some very specific details about Vienna. Then everyone goes back to their normal lives. Like hell, Marcus snarled. But when he turned to Ruth for support, he saw something that destroyed the last of his hope. His grandmother was actually considering it. The calculation was naked on her face, weighing Katarina's life against Marcus's, measuring 18 months of raising her grandson against decades-old loyalties. Ruth, Katarina said softly, understanding immediately. It's all right. I've been living on borrowed time since 1967 anyway. No. Marcus stepped between them, his voice shaking with betrayal and desperate resolve. We don't trade lives, we don't abandon people who need help. Isn't that what got my parents killed? Being decent human beings? Ruth's face crumpled. Marcus, you don't understand. Alexander won't stop. If we run tonight, he'll find us tomorrow or next week or next year. But if we give him what he wants, he'll kill all of us anyway," Marcus finished. "Because that's what killers do." The footsteps outside had stopped. The silence felt more ominous than the noise. Marcus looked around the cabin one last time, at the chess game still frozen mid-move, at his grandmother's hidden arsenal, at Katarina's impossibly young eyes filled with resignation. Everything precious was about to be lost. All their plans had crumbled, and somewhere in the red-shadowed darkness, Marcus realized they were completely, utterly trapped. In that moment of absolute despair, something clicked in Marcus's mind, not hope, but clarity. The red emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the cabin, and as he looked at the chess game, frozen mid-move, a memory surfaced with startling vividness. His father's voice, patient and warm. "The best chess players don't win by making brilliant moves, Marcus. They win by seeing what their opponent missed." Marcus stared at the board, his pulse hammering. The game Ruth had been playing against herself, white and black pieces locked in eternal combat, suddenly made terrible sense. She hadn't been playing chess at all. She'd been teaching herself to think like Alexander Petrov. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "The chess game. You've been studying him." His grandmother's eyes snapped to his, and he saw recognition flicker there. Understanding. She'd been preparing for this confrontation for 18 months, analyzing every possible move and countermove. "You never intended to run," Marcus continued, the revelation building like an avalanche in his mind. "All that talk about safe houses and escape routes. You were buying time." Katarina turned to stare at Ruth, her young face twisted with confusion and growing horror. "What is he talking about?" But Marcus was seeing everything now, all the pieces falling into their proper places. "The letters weren't from him," he said, pointing toward the door where Alexander waited. "You've been sending them. You've been triggering Katarina's memories deliberately." Ruth's silence was confirmation enough. Marcus felt reality reshaping itself around him once again, but this time the sensation was almost liberating. The helpless victim he'd been moments before was dissolving, replaced by someone who finally understood the game being played. "You needed her to remember Vienna," he pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "Not to protect those memories, but to access them. To remember something specific that Alexander needs." "Marcus, please," Ruth began, but he was beyond stopping now. "What did you bury in Vienna, Ruth? What secret is worth all these lives?" The question hung in the red-lit air like an accusation, and Marcus saw his grandmother's careful composure finally crack. Tears tracked down her weathered cheeks, but her grip on the gun never wavered. "Location coordinates," she whispered. "For a cache of documents that could destroy careers, topple governments, get hundreds of people killed. Information that was supposed to die with the Cold War." Katarina's face went white. "The Mendelssohn archive." "Oh God, Ruth, you didn't." "I was 26 years old," Ruth snapped, decades of buried guilt exploding to the surface. "I thought I was saving the world, keeping those files from falling into the wrong hands. I scattered the location data across 6 different assets' memories, then helped them all disappear into new lives." "But memories fade," Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. "Unless they're refreshed." "Unless they're triggered," Katarina corrected, her voice hollow with betrayal. "The letters, the episodes watching me remember, you've been forcing my mind to rebuild the neural pathways, making me remember so you could extract the coordinates before Alexander got them himself." Ruth's weapon was steady, but her voice shook. "He's been hunting the archive for 30 years, killing assets one by one, trying to piece together the location. Your parents stumbled into his path because David was too good at finding hidden people, and Alexander couldn't risk that kind of exposure." The cruel mathematics of it staggered Marcus. His parents had died not as heroes trying to save abandoned spies, but as obstacles to a treasure hunt that had been going on since before he was born. Ruth had spent 18 months playing grieving grandmother while orchestrating an elaborate psychological manipulation of a woman who trusted her completely. "So what's the plan?" Marcus asked, his voice cold with fury. "You get the coordinates from Katarina, then what? Trade them to Alexander for our lives?" "I trade them for his death," Ruth corrected. "Those coordinates don't lead to the archive anymore. I moved it years ago. But Alexander doesn't know that." Marcus felt the world shift one final time. Ruth hadn't been preparing to surrender or flee. She'd been preparing an ambush. The helpless elderly woman had always been an act, but so had the defeated spy ready to negotiate. Through the storm, Alexander's voice called out again, patience wearing thin. "Time's running short, Ruth. My associates are getting cold." Ruth looked at Marcus and Katarina, and for the first time in months he saw his grandmother clearly. Not the caring caretaker or the guilt-ridden former agent, but the operative who'd survived decades in the deadliest game on Earth. "The coordinates," she said to Katarina. "Are they clear in your memory now?" Katarina nodded, understanding finally dawning in her impossibly young eyes. "Good," Ruth said, moving toward the door, "because we're going to end this tonight." Marcus realized with crystal clarity that everything, the storm, the siege, even his own presence here, had been orchestrated. He wasn't a victim or even a survivor. He was bait. The word hit Marcus like a physical blow, but instead of crumbling under its weight, something unexpected happened. He straightened. The rage that had been building since he'd learned the truth about his parents' death crystallized into something harder, more focused. If Ruth had been using him as bait, then he'd make damn sure that bait had teeth. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the red-shadowed cabin with surprising authority. "I'm done being anyone's pawn." Ruth paused at the door, her weathered hand frozen on the handle. "Marcus, you don't understand what you're—" "I understand perfectly." He stepped between his grandmother and Katarina, positioning himself at the center of the small space. "You've been playing chess with my life for 18 months. Alexander's been hunting people for 30 years. Everyone's been moving pieces around the board except the people actually getting killed." Katarina watched him with those impossibly young eyes, but Marcus caught something there he hadn't seen before, not resignation but calculation. She was assessing him, measuring his resolve against the magnitude of what they faced. "What are you proposing?" she asked quietly. Marcus looked around the cabin, his mind working faster than it ever had. The emergency lighting cast everything in bloody shadows, but those shadows also meant concealment. The storm outside was deafening, but storms cut both ways. If they couldn't call for help, Alexander's team couldn't coordinate properly either. "Ruth's right about one thing," he said, moving to the weapons cache with newfound purpose. "We end this tonight, but not by feeding him false coordinates and hoping he falls for a 30-year-old spy's trap." "Then how?" Ruth demanded. But Marcus was already reaching for his father's hunting rifle, the weapon David Holloway had taught him to use for protection in the mountains, never imagining his son would need it for war. "By giving him exactly what he wants," Marcus said, checking the rifle with movements that felt like muscle memory inherited through DNA, "and making him pay for it." Katarina's eyes widened with understanding. "You want to give him the real coordinates." "I want to give him a choice," Marcus corrected. "The coordinates or our lives, but not both, never both again." Ruth's face went pale. "Marcus, the Mendelssohn archive contains enough state secrets to—" "To what? Start wars that ended before I was born?" Marcus's voice was steady now, completely calm. "My parents are dead, Ruth. Katarina's spent 60 years living a stolen life. You've been carrying guilt that's eating you alive. How many more people die to protect information about governments that don't even exist anymore?" Through the storm, Alexander's voice called out again. But this time, Marcus heard something different in it. Not patience wearing thin, but genuine cold. The kind of chill that came from standing in a blizzard for too long while your targets refused to cooperate. "That's our advantage," Marcus said suddenly, the realization hitting him like lightning. "He's been out there for at least 20 minutes. His team is spread out, probably losing sensation in their fingers. They're thinking about frostbite, not tactics. Katarina moved to the window, peering through the storm with eyes that seemed to cut through the darkness. 3 positions, maybe 4. But Marcus is right. They're not moving like they were 10 minutes ago. The bathroom window, Ruth said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. If we create a distraction at the front door, one of us could circle around behind them, Marcus finished. Get to higher ground while they're focused on the cabin. It wasn't a perfect plan. It probably wasn't even a good plan. But it was their plan, built from their choices instead of decades-old contingencies and inherited guilt. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope exactly, but something fiercer. Purpose, maybe. Or just the simple, primal satisfaction of refusing to lie down and die. "I'll take the coordinates," Katarina said quietly. "If something happens to me, the secret dies anyway. But if I make it to the ridgeline—" "You signal the ranger station," Marcus agreed. "Get help coming." Ruth was staring at both of them like they'd lost their minds. "You're children playing at spy games. Alexander Petrov has killed more people than you've met in your entire lives. Then, it's time someone stopped him," Marcus said simply. He moved to the chessboard, studying the frozen game with new eyes. White and black locked in eternal combat, neither side able to declare victory. But games had to end eventually, and someone had to make the move that changed everything. Marcus reached out and knocked over the white king. "The hardest thing about chess," he said, remembering his father's patient voice, "is learning when to sacrifice the piece you think you can't live without." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, 3 people who had been victims were becoming something else entirely. They were becoming dangerous. The sound of splintering wood announced Alexander's patience had finally expired. The front door buckled under the impact of something heavy, probably a rifle butt, and Marcus heard the distinct metallic scrape of a deadbolt being forced. "Bathroom window. Now," he whispered. But Katarina was already moving, her slight frame disappearing into the narrow hallway with the silent grace of someone whose muscle memory stretched back decades. Ruth grabbed a handful of ammunition from her hidden cache, stuffing cartridges into her coat pockets with practiced efficiency. 30 seconds, she muttered. "Then I open that door and give them something to think about." Marcus positioned himself at the corner where the hallway met the main room, his father's rifle feeling both foreign and familiar in his hands. Through the storm's howl, he could hear muffled voices, Alexander coordinating with his team, professional, even in the chaos of a mountain blizzard. West side covered, bathroom window. Marcus's blood turned to ice water. They knew about the window. "Ruth," he hissed, but his grandmother was already moving toward the front door, her weapon raised with the steady competence of someone who'd been in firefights before Marcus was born. "Change of plans," she called back grimly. "We go out fighting." The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and snow, and Marcus got his first clear look at Alexander Petrov. The man who'd called himself Dr. Graham for 18 months was gone, replaced by someone who moved like controlled violence given human form. Behind him, 2 figures in winter gear flanked the doorway, their rifles tracking methodically across the cabin's interior. "David's boy," Alexander said, his familiar voice now carrying an accent that hadn't been there during Marcus's last medical checkup. "You have your father's eyes. Same stubborn stupidity, too." Marcus fought the urge to empty his rifle into the man who'd killed his parents. Instead, he kept the weapon steady, aimed center mass, finger resting on the trigger with the patient pressure his father had taught him. "Where's Katarina?" Alexander continued, stepping carefully into the cabin. His boots crunched on glass from the shattered door, but his attention never wavered from Marcus. "Old habits, you understand. She runs, my associates become very unhappy." "Your associates are half frozen and losing motor control," Ruth said conversationally. "Mountain warfare isn't the same as urban operations, Alexander. Different skill set entirely." Something flickered across Alexander's face, not concern exactly, but calculation. Marcus realized Ruth was buying time. forcing the man to divide his attention between immediate threats and tactical considerations. From somewhere behind the cabin came a sharp crack that definitely wasn't breaking wood or shifting snow. Gunfire, single shot, rifle caliber. That would be Katarina, Alexander said with genuine regret. Pity. We could have done this cleanly. White-hot rage exploded through Marcus's chest, but before he could pull the trigger, Ruth's voice cut through his fury. Could have. Past tense. But your man missed. The subtle smile that crossed Alexander's face faltered as a new sound reached them through the storm, distant but unmistakable. The deep, throaty growl of a snowcat engine, the kind the Park Service used for emergency rescues in impossible weather. You see, Alexander, Ruth continued, her weapon never wavering, the thing about Katarina is that she remembers Vienna now. All of it, including the emergency protocols we established for exactly this situation. Marcus felt hope flicker in his chest, but Alexander was already moving, his rifle swinging toward Ruth with deadly intent. Time slowed to crystalline clarity. Marcus could see the decision forming in the man's eyes, the precise moment when calculation gave way to desperate action. Marcus pulled the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the confined space, but even as the weapon kicked against his shoulder, he knew he'd missed. Alexander had anticipated the shot, dropping into a combat crouch that spoke of decades surviving people trying to kill him. But the miss had served its purpose. Ruth's return fire caught Alexander high in the shoulder, spinning him toward the wall in a spray of blood that looked black in the red emergency lighting. The figures in the doorway opened fire, and Marcus threw himself behind the overturned chess table as bullets splintered wood inches from his head. The pieces scattered across the floor, white and black kings rolling together into the shadows. "Ruth!" he shouted, but his grandmother was already moving, using furniture for cover as she returned fire with mechanical precision. Through the chaos, Marcus heard the snowcat engine growing louder, accompanied by other sounds that made his heart race with desperate hope. Diesel engines, multiple vehicles, the organized noise of a coordinated response. Alexander struggled to his feet, blood streaming down his left arm, his face twisted with the fury of a man who'd spent 30 years hunting a secret, only to have it slip through his fingers at the final moment. "This isn't over," he snarled, but he was already retreating toward the shattered door. Marcus rose from cover, his rifle trained on the man who'd destroyed his family. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." Outside, searchlights cut through the storm like silver swords, and Marcus finally understood what his father had meant about the pieces you couldn't live without. Sometimes you saved them by refusing to sacrifice anything at all. The searchlights swept closer, but Alexander wasn't finished. Even wounded and outnumbered, he moved with the lethal efficiency of a man who'd turned desperation into an art form over 3 decades of hunting secrets. "The coordinates," he called out, his voice carrying over the approaching engines with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ruth knows I'll find them eventually. How many more people die while she plays games with ghosts?" Marcus kept his rifle trained on Alexander's center mass, but doubt crept into his mind like ice water. The man was bleeding, cornered, facing overwhelming force, yet he spoke with the confidence of someone holding winning cards. "You're bluffing," Marcus said. But even as the words left his mouth, he saw Alexander's smile. "Am I? Tell me, boy, where exactly do you think your precious Katarina learned to signal for help in a blizzard? Those aren't rescue protocols she's using out there." The diesel engines were closer now, but something in Alexander's tone made Marcus's blood freeze. Through the storm, he could hear voices calling out in coordination, but they weren't speaking English. "Ruth," Marcus called without taking his eyes off Alexander. "Who exactly is Katarina signaling?" His grandmother's silence was answer enough. "The Mendelssohn Archive isn't just American secrets," Alexander continued, pressing his advantage like a master chess player seeing the endgame unfold. 60 years of intelligence from 6 different countries, all of it pointing to operations that never officially existed. Your grandmother scattered the coordinates among assets, yes, but she never mentioned that some of those assets were working for other services entirely. Marcus felt reality reshaping itself one final time, but now the sensation brought only exhaustion. Every answer led to deeper questions, every revelation exposed new betrayals. He was 17 years old and tired of being the piece everyone else moved around the board. "So what's the truth?" he demanded, his voice raw with 18 months of accumulated grief and rage. "Did Katarina signal the park service, or the people trying to kill us?" "Both," Ruth said quietly, her weapon still trained on the doorway. "Emergency frequencies work that way. Everyone monitoring gets the same signal." The approaching engines were loud enough now to rattle the cabin's remaining windows. Multiple vehicles, coordinated approach, professional execution. Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that they'd moved from the frying pan into something infinitely worse. "Last chance, Ruth," Alexander called out, but he was no longer retreating toward the door. Instead, he'd positioned himself to use the approaching forces as cover, turning their rescue into his shield. "Give me the real coordinates, or explain to your grandson why everyone who responds to that distress call becomes a target." Through the storm, Marcus could see lights now, not just the sweeping searchlights, but the steady beams of vehicles taking tactical positions around the cabin. Professional spacing, overlapping fields of fire, the methodical setup of people who'd done this before. "How many?" Marcus asked his grandmother, and was amazed by how calm his voice sounded. "Unknown," Ruth admitted. "Could be Park Service, could be Federal Response, could be Alexander's backup team. In this weather, with those signals crossing," she didn't need to finish. They'd been playing chess while other players had been setting up their own games entirely. Marcus looked around the cabin one final time. At the scattered chess pieces, the emergency lighting casting everything in bloody shadows, the weapons cache that had seemed so reassuring minutes earlier. Then he looked at his grandmother, seeing not the woman who'd raised him or the spy who'd manipulated him, but simply another human being who'd been carrying impossible weight for far too long. "The coordinates," he said quietly. "Give him the real ones, Marcus." "All of this," he continued, gesturing toward the approaching lights, 30 years of killing, my parents' deaths, Katarina's stolen life. It's all because people keep thinking some information is worth more than human lives. But information doesn't bleed. Information doesn't grieve. Information doesn't love anyone." Alexander was listening now, his weapon lowered slightly, genuine surprise replacing tactical calculation. "So here's what we're going to do," Marcus said, his father's rifle steady in his hands. "Ruth gives you the coordinates. You call off whatever backup you've got coming, and then we all walk away from this cabin and never see each other again." "And if I refuse?" Alexander asked. Marcus smiled, and for the first time in 18 months, felt genuinely at peace with his choice. "Then we all die here together," he said simply, "and your precious archive stays buried forever." Outside, the engines had stopped. In the sudden relative quiet, Marcus could hear boots on snow, voices coordinating in multiple languages, the careful sounds of professionals taking positions. The final test wasn't about choosing the right answer. It was about refusing to play a game where everyone lost. The first voice through the megaphone shattered the cabin's tense silence like a gunshot. "Federal agents, this is a joint task force operation. The cabin is surrounded. Exit with hands visible, or we will deploy tactical measures." Marcus felt his last thread of hope snap. Not Park Service, not rescue. The cavalry had arrived, but they were wearing the wrong uniforms. Alexander's wounded smile widened into something triumphant. "Joint task force," he repeated, savoring each word. How wonderfully bureaucratic. Russian SVR, American CIA, probably a few others who've been tracking the archive's breadcrumbs for decades, all here for our little family reunion. Through the shattered door, tactical lights painted the interior in stark white and black. Marcus counted at least 6 different angles, which meant they were surrounded by enough firepower to level the entire cabin. "This isn't over," Marcus said, but even he could hear the defeat in his voice. "No," Alexander agreed, checking his wounded shoulder with clinical detachment. But it's about to become someone else's problem entirely. Ruth moved closer to Marcus, her weapon still raised but her movements betraying the exhaustion of a woman who'd been fighting the same war for 30 years. "The coordinates are useless now," she said quietly. "Too many players, too many agendas, even if we give them what they want." She didn't need to finish. Marcus could see it playing out. Competing intelligence services, each convinced they deserved the archive more than the others, turning a simple extraction into an international incident on American soil. 30 seconds, the megaphone announced. "Then we're coming in." Alexander was moving toward the door but not retreating, positioning himself to surrender to the incoming forces. The smart play. Let the professionals sort out jurisdiction while he waited for an opportunity to exploit the chaos. Marcus realized with crystal clarity that this was the moment. Not when he'd confronted Alexander, not when he'd demanded the truth from Ruth, but right now, when all the adults had played their hands and proven that their solutions only created bigger problems. "There's another choice," he said suddenly. Both Alexander and Ruth turned to stare at him, but Marcus was already moving, slinging his father's rifle across his back and heading not toward the door or the bathroom window, but toward the cabin's back wall where Ruth had shown him the hidden weapons cache. "Marcus, what are you—" He found what he was looking for wedged behind the false panel, 3 road flares and a hand-crank emergency radio, the kind serious mountain climbers carried for situations where cell towers couldn't reach. "Emergency broadcast frequency," he said, cranking the radio to life with sharp, efficient motions his father had drilled into him during childhood camping trips. "Open channel that every service monitors. 15 seconds. Marcus keyed the radio and spoke in the clear, steady voice he'd learned from watching Ruth handle crisis situations. "This is Marcus Holloway broadcasting emergency traffic on guard frequency. I am 17 years old, unarmed, and requesting immediate media attention at Silvermine Trail coordinates." He rattled off their exact location from memory. "Federal agents are about to assault a cabin containing civilians. I repeat, requesting immediate media attention at this location." Alexander's face went pale. "You have no idea what you're doing." "Sure I do," Marcus said, still broadcasting. "I'm making this everyone's problem instead of just ours. CNN, Fox News, whoever's monitoring emergency frequencies tonight, they're all going to want to know why federal agents are conducting operations against teenagers in a blizzard." Through the radio's static, a voice responded almost immediately. "Emergency traffic. This is KOA News Radio Denver. We copy your transmission and are dispatching a helicopter to your location." Then another. "This is Channel 7 News. We have your coordinates and are en route." Alexander lunged toward the radio, but Marcus was already moving, the flares in his hand. He pulled the first one and hurled it through the broken door into the snow outside, where it erupted in brilliant red light that would be visible for miles. "Hold, hold, do not advance." The voice through the megaphone had changed, carrying the urgent tone of someone whose mission parameters had just shifted dramatically. Federal agents could disappear civilians in remote mountains, but they couldn't disappear civilians who just broadcast their location to every news organization in Colorado. Marcus lit the second flare and threw it toward a different window, turning the cabin's immediate area into a beacon that no helicopter pilot could miss. "You brilliant, reckless boy," Ruth breathed. But her voice carried something Marcus hadn't heard in months, genuine pride. Alexander stood in the doorway, blood still seeping from his shoulder, but his weapon now lowered as tactical reality shifted around him. "This doesn't end the archive," he said quietly. "It just delays the inevitable." Marcus lit the final flare but held on to it, the red light casting his face in sharp relief as he met Alexander's eyes directly. "Maybe," he said, "but some things are worth delaying." In the distance, the distinctive whup-whup-whup of helicopter rotors cut through the storm. The helicopter rotors grew louder, but Marcus barely heard them over the sound of his own heart hammering against his ribs. The third flare burned in his hand like a tiny red star, casting everything in the cabin into sharp relief. The scattered chess pieces, Alexander's blood on the floor, Ruth's face drawn tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Through the radio static came another voice. "This is Denver Post Newsroom. We're tracking multiple agency frequencies coordinating at your location. Can you confirm federal presence?" Marcus looked at the radio, then at Alexander, then at his grandmother. The moment stretched between them like a wire under tension, and he realized that everything, his parents' deaths, Katarina's stolen decades, 30 years of buried secrets, had led to this single choice. He keyed the radio again. "This is Marcus Holloway. I can confirm federal agents are surrounding our position. They're here because my grandmother has information about Cold War operations that people want to stay buried." "Marcus, no." Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, but he heard her clearly over the static and the approaching helicopters. "She spent 30 years protecting those secrets," Marcus continued into the radio, his voice steady despite everything. "People have died for them. My parents died for them. But I'm 17 years old, and I don't want to die for something that happened before I was born." Alexander was staring at him now with something that might have been respect. "You're broadcasting operational details on an open frequency." "I'm broadcasting the truth," Marcus said. "There's a difference." The radio crackled. "Federal agencies are requesting news helicopters maintain distance. We're being ordered to..." The transmission cut to static. Through the broken door, Marcus could see tactical lights repositioning, moving with renewed urgency. The media attention had changed the equation, but it had also accelerated the timeline. Whatever was going to happen would happen fast. "Ruth," Alexander said quietly, "give me the coordinates. All of them. Real ones this time." Marcus expected his grandmother to refuse, to fight, to maintain the silence she'd kept for 3 decades. Instead, she lowered her weapon and reached into her jacket pocket. "What are you doing?" Marcus demanded. "What I should have done years ago." Ruth pulled out a small notebook, its pages yellowed with age, the complete list, every cache site, every dead drop, every piece of the Mendelssohn archive. She held the notebook toward Alexander, but her eyes were on Marcus. Some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone. Alexander stepped forward, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side, but before he could reach for the notebook, Marcus moved. Not toward Alexander, not toward the door where federal agents waited with enough firepower to end this permanently. He moved toward the wood-burning stove in the cabin's corner, where coals still glowed red beneath the ash. "Marcus, don't." This from Alexander, real panic in his voice for the first time. 30 years, Marcus said, taking the notebook from Ruth's unresisting fingers. 30 years of people killing each other over information that should have been destroyed when the Berlin Wall came down. He held the notebook over the stove's open door, feeling the heat against his palm. The pages were old, dry. They would burn fast and completely. "You don't understand what you're destroying," Alexander said, but he wasn't moving closer. "That archive contains proof of operations that could destabilize." "Operations that are already over," Marcus cut him off. "Wars that ended before I was born. The only thing this information does now is get people killed." Through the radio's static, he heard distant voices. "News helicopters are being turned back by federal aircraft. This is unprecedented coordination between agencies." Marcus looked at his grandmother one final time. "The pieces you can't live without," he said softly, remembering their chess game that felt like a lifetime ago. "Sometimes you save them by refusing to play a game where they're at risk." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the only way to win is to take the board away." Marcus opened his fingers. The notebook fell into the coals with a soft whisper, and 30 years of secrets went up in flames that painted the cabin walls in dancing orange light. The pages curled and blackened, decades of coordinates and code names, and carefully hidden truths transforming into ash and smoke. Alexander made a sound like a wounded animal and lunged forward, but it was too late. The fire consumed everything. Locations, names, the careful architecture of a conspiracy that had outlived its purpose by decades. "It's done," Marcus said, watching the last page crumble into nothing. "It's finally done." Outside, the federal agents were shouting orders, but their urgency had shifted. Without the archive to secure, their mission had just transformed from recovery to damage control. Marcus dropped the spent flare and picked up the radio one last time. "This is Marcus Holloway," he broadcast. "The information everyone was looking for just went up in smoke. Time to go home." The radio went silent first. Then the tactical lights outside shifted, sweeping patterns changing from assault positioning to something more like confusion. Marcus could hear voices through the storm, but the urgency had drained out of them like air from a punctured tire. Alexander slumped against the cabin wall, his good hand pressed to his wounded shoulder, staring at the wood stove where the last fragments of ash drifted upward like black snow. 40 years, he said quietly. 40 years tracking those leads, and you just erased it all. Not erased, Marcus corrected, surprised by how calm he felt. Finished. Ruth was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she watched the final embers consume what remained of her life's work. But her tears weren't grief. They were relief, pure and simple, the kind of release that came after carrying impossible weight for too long. "Your parents," she whispered. "They would have been proud." Outside, engines were starting. Not the coordinated tactical approach they'd heard earlier, but the scattered, disorganized sound of multiple agencies realizing their mission had just evaporated. Through the broken door, Marcus could see lights withdrawing, vehicles repositioning from assault formation to departure formation. The radio crackled back to life. "Federal aircraft are departing the area. News helicopters, you are cleared to approach the coordinates." Alexander laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. Television cameras, reporters asking questions about why half the intelligence community mobilized against a teenager in a snowstorm." He looked at Marcus with something approaching admiration. "Do you have any idea what kind of shitstorm you just created?" "The kind that keeps us alive," Marcus said. Ruth wiped her eyes and moved toward the cabin's window, watching the tactical lights continue their withdrawal. "They can't disappear us now. Too many witnesses, too much attention. Whatever happens next has to happen in daylight." The immediate danger was over. Marcus could feel it in the way his shoulders finally relaxed, the way his grip loosened on his father's rifle. But something else was settling over the cabin now, something quieter but no less profound. Alexander pushed himself away from the wall, testing his wounded arm with careful movements. "The archive may be gone, but the people who wanted it aren't. They'll adapt, find new targets, new sources." "That's not my problem," Marcus said, and meant it. "I'm not my grandmother. I'm not you. I'm not responsible for cleaning up 30-year-old messes. You're responsible for the new ones you just created," Alexander pointed out. "Destroying classified information, broadcasting operational details, interfering with federal operations." "I'm 17, Marcus interrupted, "and according to the media I just contacted, I'm a victim of an illegal federal assault. My lawyer, when I get one, is going to have a field day with this." Ruth actually smiled at that. "You sound like your father. He always did have a talent for turning disadvantages into leverage." The helicopter rotors were much closer now, the distinctive whine of news choppers rather than military aircraft. Through the storm, Marcus could see lights approaching, but these were the harsh white spots of television cameras, not tactical illumination. "What about Katarina?" Marcus asked suddenly. "Eleanor, I mean. What happens to her now?" Alexander's expression softened slightly. Without the archive to trace, without the pressure to recover her memories, she might actually have a chance at peace. 60 years of stolen time, but whatever years she has left could be her own. "And you?" Alexander looked at his wounded shoulder, then at the approaching helicopters, then at the ashes of his life's work cooling in the stove. "I disappear," he said simply. "Find a new identity, a new purpose. The game is over, but there are always new games. That's not living, Ruth said quietly. That's just existing. It's what people like me do, Alexander replied. What people like us do. Survive until the next crisis needs fixing. Marcus watched his grandmother's face as Alexander spoke, seeing the recognition there, the acknowledgement of a life spent in shadows, moving from one emergency to the next without ever finding solid ground. Not anymore, Marcus said. Not for us. The first helicopter was overhead now, its searchlight cutting through the blizzard to illuminate the cabin and its surroundings. Within minutes, this remote mountain clearing would be flooded with reporters, cameras, and questions that would force everything into daylight. Alexander moved toward the cabin's back window, the one Ruth had shown Marcus earlier. "This is where I leave," he said. "Consider us even. You saved Eleanor. I gave you the truth about your parents. Everyone pays their debts." He paused at the window, looking back one final time. For what it's worth, destroying the archive was the right choice. I just couldn't make it myself. Then he was gone, disappearing into the storm like smoke, leaving only Marcus and Ruth to face whatever came next. The helicopters landed like mechanical birds settling into a nest of swirling snow, their rotors whipping the storm into chaos before finally shutting down. Marcus watched through the broken door as figures emerged, not the tactical teams that had surrounded them an hour ago, but reporters in heavy coats, cameramen with equipment wrapped in plastic, producers barking orders into headsets. "Ready for this?" Ruth asked, checking her appearance in the cabin's small mirror. She'd holstered her weapon and smoothed her grey hair, transforming herself from government operative back into mountain grandmother with practiced ease. Marcus shouldered his father's rifle and stepped into the spotlight that flooded through the doorway. "I'm ready." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of questions, cameras, and carefully worded answers. Marcus told the truth, or at least the parts of it that wouldn't get anyone killed. An elderly neighbor had collapsed in the storm. He'd carried her to safety. Federal agents had arrived asking questions about her past, but the situation had been resolved peacefully. He didn't mention time travel or stolen decades or classified archives burning to ash. Some stories were too impossible to tell, and some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. When the news crews finally departed, promising follow-up interviews and ongoing coverage of federal overreach in rural communities, Marcus and Ruth found themselves alone in the cabin for the first time since this all began. "We should check on Eleanor," Ruth said quietly. "Katarina, whatever name she's choosing to go by now." They drove back to the Blackwood house in Ruth's truck, through snow that had finally begun to ease. The storm was breaking apart, revealing patches of star-studded sky between the clouds. By morning, the mountain would be pristine white again, beautiful and innocent, as if none of this had ever happened. Eleanor, Katarina, was awake when they arrived, sitting by her fireplace with a photo album open in her lap. She looked up when they entered, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before: peace. "I remember some things now," she said softly. "Not everything, but pieces. Enough to know that I lost 60 years, but also enough to understand that those years weren't really mine to lose." She showed them the photo album, pictures of Eleanor Blackwood's life with her husband, their decades together in this house, the gradual aging that Katarina had missed while locked in her 22-year-old memories. "I think I can live with this," she said. "The confusion is fading. I know who I was, and I know who I became, and somehow they both feel real." Marcus sat beside her, studying the photographs. "What will you do now?" "Learn to be old," Katarina smiled. "It's not as frightening as I thought it would be. And you, what will you do?" Marcus looked out the window at the mountain landscape he'd grown up in, the peaks and valleys that had been his whole world until a few days ago. "Go back to school, I guess. Take my SATs. Figure out college." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't the complete answer. He was still Marcus Holloway, still 17, still living with his grandmother in the Colorado Rockies. But something fundamental had shifted inside him. A weight lifted, a clarity gained. "You're different," Ruth observed as they drove home later, older somehow. "So are you," Marcus replied, and it was true. His grandmother sat straighter behind the wheel, her face relaxed in a way he hadn't seen since childhood. 30 years of secrets had left lines around her eyes, but now those lines seemed to be smoothing out in real time. They spent the next morning cleaning up the cabin, repairing the door, sweeping up the ash from the stove, putting the chess set back in order. It was mundane work, but necessary. The dramatic part of their story was over. Now came the harder task of learning to live normal lives again. "I've been thinking about your parents," Ruth said as they worked, "about the way they really died. Maybe it's time we visited their graves together." Marcus paused in his sweeping. He'd avoided the cemetery for months, unable to face the stone markers that bore his parents' names, but something about his grandmother's suggestion felt right, not painful, but necessary. "I'd like that," he said. That afternoon, they drove to the small mountain cemetery where David and Sarah Holloway rested beneath matching granite headstones. Marcus knelt in the snow and told them about the past few days, about the courage he'd found, the choices he'd made, the truth he'd learned about their sacrifice. "They would have been proud," Ruth said again, her hand warm on his shoulder. Marcus stood up, brushing snow from his knees. For the first time since their deaths, he felt his parents' presence, not as absence but as foundation, the solid ground beneath his feet as he faced whatever came next. The mountains stretched around them, vast and eternal and home. Marcus breathed in the crisp mountain air, watching it mist before his face, as he and Ruth walked back to the truck. The cemetery felt different now, not like a place of endings, but of continuance. His parents were still gone, but the crushing weight of guilt that had followed him for months had lifted, replaced by something steadier, acceptance. "I'm going back to school tomorrow," he said as they drove down the winding mountain road. Ruth glanced at him, eyebrows raised. "You sure you're ready? It's only been a week since I burned down a Cold War conspiracy and got into a standoff with federal agents." Marcus found himself smiling. "Yeah, I think I can handle trigonometry." The truth was, school felt manageable now in a way it hadn't for months. His classmates' problems, college applications, dating drama, sports rivalries, would seem small after what he'd been through. But small in a good way, normally small. They stopped at Eleanor's house on the way home. She was in her garden, of all places, brushing snow off the dormant rose bushes with careful, methodical movements. She looked up when they approached, and Marcus was struck again by how peacefully the two versions of herself seemed to coexist behind her eyes. "I've been thinking about names," she said without preamble. "Eleanor feels right for who I became, but Katarina feels right for who I was. I think I might keep both. Eleanor Katarina Blackwood. It has a nice sound, doesn't it?" "It does," Marcus agreed. "How are you feeling?" "Old," she laughed. "Genuinely old for the first time in decades. My knees hurt, my back aches, and I'm tired by 8 o'clock. It's wonderful." Ruth smiled. "There's something to be said for aging gracefully instead of all at once." Eleanor nodded, then fixed Marcus with a serious look. "I wanted to thank you, not just for carrying me out of that storm, but for making the choice you made. Alexander told me what you did before he left. Burning those records, that took courage." "It took being tired," Marcus corrected. "Tired of old secrets ruining new lives. Sometimes that's the same thing." They talked for a few more minutes about ordinary things. The weather, Eleanor's plans to renovate her guest room, Ruth's intention to finally teach Marcus to drive stick shift. Normal conversations about normal futures, the kind Marcus had thought might be lost forever. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor caught Marcus's sleeve. "Your parents," she said quietly. "Ruth told me what really happened to them. You should know, the work they did, the choices they made, they saved lives. Maybe not in ways that made headlines, but in real, measurable ways. That matters." Marcus nodded, throat tight. "I know. Good. Don't forget it when life gets ordinary again. Heroes don't always get recognition, but that doesn't make them less heroic." The truck ride home was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind of silence that came from understanding rather than secrets. As they pulled into their driveway, Marcus could see their cabin the way a stranger might. Small, weathered, perched on the mountainside like it had grown there naturally. It looked like home. That evening they played chess again. Marcus had improved over the past week, but Ruth still won handily. The difference was that losing didn't frustrate him anymore. It was just chess, a game, not a metaphor for all the ways life could go wrong. "Your move?" Ruth said, studying the board. Marcus moved his knight, then leaned back in his chair. "Do you miss it, the work you used to do?" Ruth considered the question as seriously as she considered her chess moves. "Sometimes," she admitted. There was a clarity to it, clear objectives, clear methods, clear victories and defeats. Real life is messier, but better? Much better. She moved her queen, not for checkmate, but to open new possibilities on the board. "I get to watch you grow up. I get to have normal conversations with neighbors. I get to worry about ordinary things like grocery lists and whether the truck needs new tires." Marcus smiled. "Sounds boring." "It is. Gloriously, wonderfully boring." They finished the game. Marcus lost, but played well enough to force Ruth to work for her victory. As they put the pieces away, Marcus felt the satisfaction of a ritual restored, a tradition that belonged to them and no one else. Later, alone in his room, Marcus looked out at the mountain peaks silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, Alexander was probably starting a new identity, pursuing new secrets. Somewhere, other people were carrying burdens that felt impossible to bear. But here, in this small cabin, Marcus Holloway was exactly who he was supposed to be, 17 years old, learning to drive stick shift, worried about SATs and college applications. His parents were gone, but their foundation held. His grandmother was free of 30 years of secrets. An elderly widow had found peace with her impossible past. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was something better, a new beginning. The mountains stretched around them all, vast and eternal and home.